You have come here perhaps because something within you knows that the conventional wisdom about addiction is fundamentally flawed. If you have wandered into this space tonight, then know this. We do not gather merely to speak of willpower or recovery programs. No, we are gathered here to invoke something far more ancient and powerful, something that the modern mind has forgotten in its rush toward quick fixes and surface solutions. When I speak of addiction, I do not speak of a simple lack of discipline or moral failing. I speak of a psychic possession, a hijacking of the soul's natural compass by forces that operate beneath the threshold of conscious awareness, and that is not always comfortable to confront. The mind trick I will share with you tonight has been stripped of its power by those who would make it palatable, digestible, sellable to the masses. When a truth becomes too popular, it usually loses its teeth. The addiction, as I have encountered it through years of working with the human psyche, is not merely a craving for substances or behaviors. No, true addiction is a shadow dance, a choreographed performance between the conscious self and the exiled parts of the soul that have been abandoned, forgotten, pushed into the darkness. To understand this, we must look beneath the surface symptoms, beneath even the neuroscience explanations, for addiction is not merely chemical dependency, it is archetypal possession by forces we have refused to acknowledge. Imagine a person walking through life with their shadow trailing long behind them, untouched, unloved, feared. That shadow carries within it every impulse, every desire, every aspect of the self that was deemed unacceptable by family, society, or the persona we constructed to survive. And that shadow grows hungry. It seeks expression. It demands to be fed. And when we refuse to feed it consciously, it takes what it needs through the back door of compulsion. In one of my most vivid encounters with this phenomenon, I worked with a man who had struggled with gambling for 15 years. Brilliant, successful, beloved by his family, yet every few months he would disappear for days, losing thousands at casino tables. When we began to excavate the psychological landscape beneath his compulsion, what emerged was not weakness but a starving part of his psyche that had never been allowed to take risks, to feel alive, to experience the thrill of uncertainty that his controlled life had systematically eliminated. The man could not see that his gambling was not really about money or winning. It was about feeding an aspect of himself that had been buried alive, the wild one, the risk-taker, the part that refused to live in the sanitized prison of respectability. His addiction was not a disease. It was a desperate attempt at wholeness, a crude form of self-medication for a soul split in two. This is the first truth you must understand. Your addiction is not your enemy. It is a messenger. It is your psyche's crude attempt to restore balance to a system that has been thrown off its natural axis. The mind trick that ends addiction forever is not about fighting the compulsion. It is about understanding what the compulsion is trying to tell you. But here is where most people stumble. They hear this and think it means they should simply indulge their addictions, give in to every impulse, let the shadow run wild. This is not integration. This is possession. The shadow, when unconscious, does not seek balance. It seeks domination. It will destroy everything in its path to get what it needs. The alcoholic shadow does not simply want to drink, it wants to drown. The gambling shadow does not want excitement, it wants to burn down the entire life structure. The mind trick I am speaking of requires something far more sophisticated than surrender or resistance. It requires what I call conscious dialogue with the possessing force. Most people try to fight their addictions like they are battling an external enemy. They use willpower like a sword, cutting away at the symptoms while the root system grows stronger in the darkness. Others try to understand their addictions intellectually, mapping the neural pathways and chemical cascades, believing that knowledge alone will set them free. Both approaches miss the mark. The mind trick that works operates on a different level entirely, the level of imagination, of symbolic thinking, of direct engagement with the archetypal forces that animate compulsive behavior. You must learn to speak the language that addiction speaks, which is not the language of logic or discipline, but the language of images, of symbols, of mythic narratives that have been playing out in the human psyche since the beginning of time. Let me share with you the story of Sarah, a woman who came to me after years of struggling with what she called her shopping addiction. She would find herself in stores at all hours, buying things she did not need, filling her home with objects that brought her no joy, maxing out credit cards in pursuit of something she could never quite name. Traditional therapy had labelled her behaviour as retail therapy, a way of managing depression and anxiety. But when we went deeper, what we found was far more interesting. In her dreams, Sarah would often find herself in vast, empty warehouses filled with beautiful objects just out of reach. She would wake with a profound sense of loss, as if something precious had been taken from her before she could claim it. As we explored these images, what emerged was not a story about materialism or consumer culture, but a story about a little girl who had learned that love was scarce, that she had to compete for attention, that there was never enough to go around. Her shopping was not about acquiring objects, it was about trying to fill a void that had been carved into her psyche decades earlier. The addiction was her soul's attempt to heal a wound that had never been acknowledged, let alone treated. But here is the crucial point. Once Sarah understood this, she did not simply stop shopping. That would have been suppression, not transformation. Instead, she learned to dialogue with the hungry part of herself that drove the compulsion. She began to ask different questions, not how do I stop shopping, but what does this part of me really need? What is it trying to create? How can I feed this hunger in a way that actually nourishes rather than depletes? This shift in questioning, from resistance to curiosity, from warfare to dialogue, is at the heart of the mind trick that dissolves addiction. When you approach your addiction as a teacher rather than a tormentor, when you begin to listen to what it is trying to tell you about the unlived parts of your life, something remarkable begins to happen. The compulsion begins to lose its grip, not because you have defeated it, but because you have given it what it was actually seeking all along. Not the substance or behavior itself, but the psychological nutrition that the substance or behavior was a crude substitute for. This is not a quick fix. This is not a technique you can apply like a band-aid to a wound that requires surgery. The mind trick I speak of demands that you become an archaeologist of your own soul, digging through layers of conditioning and adaptation to find the buried treasures that your addiction has been trying to unearth. It requires you to develop a relationship with parts of yourself that you have spent years trying to eliminate or control. The process begins with a radical reframe of the entire addiction narrative. Instead of seeing yourself as broken or diseased, you must begin to see yourself as someone whose psyche is so intelligent that it has created a symptom to point you toward exactly what needs attention. Your addiction is not proof of your weakness. It is proof of your soul's determination to become whole, even if it has to use the crudest possible methods to get your attention. But this reframe is only the beginning. The real work happens when you learn to enter into conscious relationship with the archetypal forces that drive compulsive behavior. This requires developing what I call mythic literacy, the ability to recognize the ancient patterns and stories that are playing out through your personal struggles. Every addiction tells a story, and that story is always bigger than the individual who is living it. The alcoholic is often living out the myth of Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, who represents the soul's longing to break free from the constraints of ordinary consciousness. The sex addict may be channeling Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, who demands that passion be honored even when society tries to suppress it. The workaholic might be possessed by the archetype of the hero, driving themselves to achieve greatness while neglecting the tender parts of the psyche that need rest and nurturing. When you begin to see your addiction as an archetypal possession rather than a personal failing, you can start to work with it on its own terms. You can begin to understand what the possessing force actually wants, what it is trying to create or restore in your life. And from that understanding, you can begin to negotiate with it, to find ways of honoring its deeper needs without letting it destroy everything you have built. This negotiation process is where the real magic happens. It is where you discover that your addiction has been trying to teach you something essential about yourself that you could not learn any other way. The gambling addict discovers their need for calculated risk and adventure. The food addict uncovers their hunger for sensual pleasure and emotional nourishment. The substance abuser finds their longing for altered states of consciousness and spiritual transcendence. None of these needs are wrong or pathological. They are human. They are sacred. They become destructive only when they are denied conscious expression and forced to seek satisfaction through compulsive behaviors that ultimately leave the deeper hunger unfed. The mind trick is learning to feed these hungers directly, consciously, in ways that actually satisfy the soul, rather than merely temporarily quieting its cries for attention. This brings us to the threshold of the actual technique itself, the mind trick that has the power to dissolve addiction at its root. But I must warn you, this is not a method for the faint of heart. It requires you to do something that every fibre of your conditioned being will resist. You must learn to love your addiction, not the behaviour itself, not the destruction it causes, not the chaos it brings to your relationships and responsibilities. But you must learn to love the part of yourself that created the addiction as a survival mechanism. You must develop genuine compassion for the wounded aspect of your psyche that has been crying out for attention through compulsive behavior. This sounds impossible, I know. How can you love something that has caused you so much pain? How can you embrace what feels like your greatest enemy? But here is what I have discovered through years of working with the possessed soul. Resistance feeds the very thing you are trying to eliminate. What you fight grows stronger in the darkness. What you hate becomes more entrenched in its position. The addiction thrives on your hatred of it. It feeds on your shame, your disgust, your desperate attempts to cut it out of your life like a tumour. Every time you go to war with your compulsion, you are actually strengthening it. You are giving it exactly what it needs to maintain its grip on your psyche, your emotional energy, your attention, your fear. But when you approach your addiction with curiosity instead of condemnation, when you begin to treat it as a teacher rather than a tormentor, something extraordinary begins to shift. The compulsion begins to relax its grip because it no longer needs to scream so loudly to get your attention. It can speak in whispers because you have finally learned to listen. Let me tell you about Michael, a surgeon who came to me after his cocaine use had nearly cost him his career. Brilliant, respected at the top of his profession. Yet he would find himself in bathroom stalls between surgeries, snorting lines of powder that promised to give him the energy and focus he felt he could not generate naturally. When we began to explore the psychological landscape beneath his addiction, what we found was a man who had been running from his own exhaustion for decades. The cocaine was not just giving him energy, it was allowing him to avoid confronting the fact that he was living a life that was fundamentally out of alignment with his deeper nature. As a child, Michael had been taught that rest was weakness, that vulnerability was dangerous, that he must always be strong, always be perfect, always be in control. The cocaine allowed him to maintain this impossible standard by artificially inflating his capacity to perform. But it was also slowly destroying his nervous system, his relationships, and his connection to his own authentic self. The breakthrough came when Michael stopped trying to quit cocaine and started trying to understand what the cocaine was doing for him that he could not do for himself. He began to see that his addiction was not a sign of weakness, but a sign that his soul was desperately trying to maintain some semblance of functionality in a life structure that was fundamentally unsustainable. Instead of fighting the urge to use, Michael began to dialogue with it. When he felt the familiar craving rise, instead of either giving in or white-knuckling his way through it, he would sit with the sensation and ask, "What do you need right now? What are you trying to tell me? What would it feel like to give you what you actually want instead of what you think you want?" This practice of conscious dialogue with the craving began to reveal layers of unmet needs that the cocaine had been crudely attempting to address. The need for energy was masking a need for purpose and meaning in his work. The need for focus was hiding a need for genuine passion and engagement. The need for chemical enhancement was covering a deep longing for spiritual connection and transcendence. As Michael began to address these deeper needs directly, changing his work schedule to allow for rest, finding ways to reconnect with his original passion for healing, exploring meditation and other practices that could provide natural states of expanded consciousness, the cocaine began to lose its hold over him, not because he had conquered it through willpower, but because he had given his psyche better options for meeting its legitimate needs. This is the essence of the mind trick. You must learn to see through the surface behavior to the legitimate psychological and spiritual needs that the addiction is trying to meet. Every addiction is a misdirected attempt at healing. Every compulsion is a crude form of self-medication for some aspect of the psyche that has been wounded, neglected, or denied expression. The alcoholic is often trying to medicate social anxiety or emotional numbness. The food addict may be attempting to fill an emotional void or to comfort a wounded inner child. The sex addict might be seeking connection and intimacy that they cannot find in their relationships. The workaholic could be running from feelings of inadequacy or trying to prove their worth through achievement. None of these underlying needs are pathological. They are human. They are natural. They become destructive only when they are forced to seek satisfaction through behaviors that cannot actually provide what the soul is hungry for. Alcohol cannot heal social anxiety. It can only mask it temporarily. Food cannot fill an emotional void. It can only distract from it briefly. Sexual compulsion cannot create genuine intimacy. It can only provide a counterfeit version that leaves the deeper hunger unfed. But here is where the mind trick becomes truly powerful. When you begin to identify and address the legitimate needs beneath the addictive behavior, you are not just treating symptoms, you are healing the soul wound that created the addiction in the first place. This requires developing what I call archetypal literacy, the ability to read the symbolic language that your addiction is speaking. Every compulsive behavior is trying to tell you a story about what your soul needs to become whole. The key is learning to decode that story and then finding healthy, sustainable ways to honor the deeper narrative that is trying to emerge. The gambler is often living out a story about risk, adventure, and the thrill of uncertainty in a life that has become too predictable and controlled. The solution is not to eliminate risk from their life, but to find conscious, constructive ways to embrace uncertainty and adventure. Perhaps they need to change careers, travel to new places, or engage in activities that provide healthy doses of excitement and unpredictability. The shopper may be acting out a story about scarcity, trying to prove to themselves that there is enough, that they are worthy of having beautiful things, that they can create abundance in their lives. The healing comes not from eliminating their desire for beautiful objects, but from addressing the underlying sense of scarcity and unworthiness that drives the compulsive acquisition. This process of archetypal translation, learning to read the deeper story that your addiction is telling, is both an art and a science. It requires you to become fluent in the language of symbols, to develop a relationship with your own unconscious, to treat your dreams and fantasies and compulsions as messages from a deeper intelligence that is always working toward your wholeness. But the mind trick has another layer that is even more profound. Once you understand what your addiction is trying to create in your life, you must learn to become a conscious creator of those experiences. You must take responsibility not just for healing your wounds, but for actively building a life that feeds your soul at the deepest level. This is where most recovery programs fall short. They focus on eliminating the problematic behavior without helping the person create a life so rich and meaningful that the addiction becomes irrelevant. They treat addiction as something to be removed rather than as a signpost pointing toward what needs to be added. The mind trick recognizes that nature abhors a vacuum. If you simply remove the addictive behavior without replacing it with something that meets the same psychological and spiritual needs, you are setting yourself up for relapse or substitution. The hunger that drove the original addiction will simply find new ways to express itself. True recovery requires conscious creation of the life your soul is actually hungry for. It requires you to become an artist of your own existence, crafting experiences and relationships and work that provide sustainable nourishment for the parts of yourself that have been starving. This is where the real transformation begins, but it requires something that most people are not prepared to do. You must descend into the underworld of your own making. You must walk into the psychological basement where all the exiled parts of yourself have been locked away, and you must face what you find there without flinching. The mind trick demands that you become intimate with your own darkness, not to indulge it, not to let it run your life, but to understand it so completely that it no longer has power over you. This is not therapy in the conventional sense. This is not positive thinking or affirmations or visualization techniques. This is archetypal surgery performed on the living soul. I worked once with a woman whose relationship with alcohol had consumed nearly 2 decades of her life. She had tried every program, every method, every approach that promised freedom from her compulsion. Yet still she found herself, night after night, reaching for the bottle that promised relief from a pain she could not name. When she came to me, she was desperate, defeated, convinced that she was fundamentally broken. But when we began to excavate the psychological terrain beneath her drinking, what we discovered was not brokenness, but a profound intelligence. Her addiction was not random, it was not weakness. It was her psyche's attempt to solve a problem that had been decades in the making. As a child, she had learned that her emotions were dangerous, that her anger could destroy relationships, that her sadness was too much for others to bear. She had been taught to be small, to be agreeable, to never rock the boat. And so she had exiled these parts of herself into the shadow, believing that by eliminating them she could be loved. But the shadow does not disappear when ignored. It festers. It grows hungry, and eventually it demands to be fed. The alcohol was not just numbing her pain. It was giving her permission to feel the emotions she had been forbidden to experience. In her intoxicated state, she could finally access her rage, her grief, her wild and untamed self. The addiction was her soul's crude attempt at integration, a desperate effort to reclaim the parts of herself that had been amputated in childhood. But it was also destroying her life, because shadow integration through chemical means is always destructive. The shadow, when accessed unconsciously, does not seek balance. It seeks revenge for all the years it has been denied. The breakthrough came when she stopped trying to eliminate her relationship with alcohol and started trying to understand what the alcohol was giving her that she could not give herself. She began to see that her drinking was not the problem. It was a symptom of a much deeper wound, a systematic disconnection from her own emotional truth. Instead of fighting the urge to drink, she began to dialogue with it. When she felt the familiar pull toward the bottle, she would sit with the sensation and ask, "What am I really thirsty for? What emotion am I trying to access? What part of myself am I trying to reclaim?" This practice of conscious inquiry began to reveal the legitimate psychological needs that the alcohol had been attempting to meet. She discovered that she was not actually addicted to alcohol. She was addicted to the permission it gave her to be fully human. The drinking was her way of accessing the wild woman, the fierce mother, the grieving daughter that she had been taught to suppress. Once she understood this, she could begin to find other ways to access these aspects of herself without destroying her liver and her relationships in the process. This is the crucial insight. Every addiction is a distorted attempt at self-reclamation. Every compulsion is your psyche trying to restore something that has been lost or denied. The mind trick works because it honors this intelligence instead of trying to override it. But here is where most people get confused. They think that understanding their addiction intellectually is enough to heal it. They believe that insight alone will set them free. This is not true. The mind trick requires something far more radical than understanding. It requires embodied transformation of your relationship with the rejected parts of yourself. You must learn to become a conscious container for the energies that have been driving your compulsive behavior. This means developing the capacity to feel your emotions without being overwhelmed by them, to access your shadow without being possessed by it, to reclaim your power without becoming destructive. This is not easy work. It requires you to develop what I call psychological musculature, the inner strength to hold paradox, to contain opposing forces, to remain centered while experiencing the full spectrum of human emotion. Most people's psychological systems are not equipped for this kind of intensity. They have been trained to either suppress their darkness or be consumed by it. They do not know how to dance with their demons. The mind trick teaches you this dance. It shows you how to engage with the archetypal forces that drive addiction without being destroyed by them. It requires you to become both warrior and lover, both fierce and tender, both disciplined and wild. You must learn to say yes to your shadow while maintaining sovereignty over your choices. Let me tell you about David, a man whose pornography addiction had isolated him from intimate relationships for over a decade. He came to me filled with shame, convinced that he was a monster, that his compulsion proved he was incapable of real love. But when we began to explore the psychological landscape beneath his behavior, what we found was not monstrosity, but profound longing. David's addiction was not really about sex. It was about his desperate hunger for beauty, for connection, for the feminine energy that he had been systematically cut off from since childhood. Raised in a household where emotions were seen as weakness, where vulnerability was punished, where the feminine was devalued, he had learned to exile his own capacity for tenderness and receptivity. The pornography was his shadow's attempt to reconnect with these lost aspects of himself. But it was a counterfeit connection, a simulation of intimacy that left him more isolated than ever. The images on the screen promised access to the feminine divine, but delivered only empty arousal and deeper disconnection from his own heart. The healing began when David stopped seeing his addiction as evidence of his depravity and started seeing it as evidence of his soul's intelligence. His compulsion was trying to teach him something essential about his need for beauty, for softness, for the sacred feminine that he had been taught to fear and suppress. Instead of trying to eliminate his desire for the feminine, David began to explore healthy ways of honoring this aspect of his nature. He began to cultivate relationships with actual women based on mutual respect and genuine connection. He started engaging with art and music and literature that fed his hunger for beauty. He began to develop his own capacity for tenderness and emotional receptivity. As he created conscious channels for the energies that had been driving his compulsion, the addiction began to lose its grip, not because he had conquered it through willpower, but because he had given his psyche better options for meeting its legitimate needs. The pornography could not compete with real intimacy, authentic beauty, genuine connection to the feminine principle, both within and without. This is the essence of the mind trick. You must learn to compete with your addiction by creating experiences that are more satisfying than the compulsive behavior itself. This requires you to become an expert in your own psychology to understand exactly what your addiction is trying to provide, and then to consciously create those experiences through healthy means. But the mind trick has another dimension that is even more profound. Once you understand what your addiction is teaching you about your deepest needs, you must learn to see it as a spiritual teacher rather than a psychological problem. Every addiction carries within it a sacred message about what your soul is hungry for. The key is learning to receive that message without being destroyed by the messenger. The alcoholic is often being called to a deeper relationship with the divine, to states of consciousness that transcend ordinary awareness. The problem is not the longing for transcendence. The problem is trying to achieve it through a substance that ultimately disconnects you from the very thing you are seeking. The food addict may be being called to a more sensual, embodied relationship with life, to greater appreciation for physical pleasure and comfort. The issue is not the desire for sensual satisfaction. The issue is trying to meet that need through compulsive consumption that ultimately numbs you to the very sensations you are craving. The sex addict might be receiving a call to deeper intimacy, to more authentic connection with others and with their own sexuality. The problem is not the hunger for connection. The problem is trying to satisfy it through behaviors that create distance rather than closeness. When you begin to see your addiction as a spiritual teacher, you can start to extract its wisdom without being enslaved by its methods. You can learn to honor the sacred message while rejecting the destructive delivery system. This requires developing what I call divine discernment, the ability to separate the gold from the dross, to receive the teaching while refusing the poison. This process of spiritual alchemy is where the real magic of the mind trick reveals itself. You begin to understand that your addiction has been trying to initiate you into something larger than yourself, to connect you with archetypal energies and transpersonal experiences that your ordinary consciousness could not access. The gambler is being initiated into the mysteries of risk and uncertainty, into a relationship with fate and chance that could teach them profound lessons about surrender and trust. The problem is that unconscious gambling creates chaos rather than wisdom, destruction rather than initiation. The workaholic is being called to discover their unique gifts and to contribute something meaningful to the world. The issue is that compulsive work often disconnects them from their true calling, turning sacred service into empty achievement. The mind trick teaches you how to receive these initiations consciously, how to access the archetypal energies that your addiction has been trying to connect you with without being destroyed by them. It shows you how to become a conscious participant in your own transformation rather than an unconscious victim of compulsive forces. This requires developing a relationship with what I call the wise witness, the part of you that can observe your psychological processes without being overwhelmed by them. This wise witness is not the critic that judges your addiction, nor the enabler that makes excuses for it. It is the neutral observer that can see the intelligence within the compulsion while maintaining clarity about its destructive effects. The wise witness asks different questions than the addicted self or the recovery-focused self. Instead of "how do I stop this behavior?" or "why am I so weak?" the wise witness asks, "What is this experience trying to teach me? What archetypal energy is trying to emerge through this compulsion? How can I honor the deeper need while protecting myself from destruction?" These questions open up entirely different possibilities for healing. They transform you from a victim of your addiction into a student of your own soul. They help you see that your compulsive behavior is not evidence of your failure, but evidence of your psyche's determination to become whole, even if it has to use the crudest possible methods to get your attention. The mind trick works because it aligns you with this deeper intelligence rather than fighting against it. It teaches you to become a conscious collaborator in your own healing rather than an unwilling patient being treated by external authorities. It shows you how to transform your relationship with your addiction from warfare to partnership, from resistance to conscious engagement. But this partnership is not permissive. It is not about giving your addiction free rein to destroy your life. It is about learning to negotiate with the archetypal forces that drive compulsive behavior, to find ways of honoring their deeper wisdom while maintaining sovereignty over your choices and actions. This negotiation process requires tremendous psychological sophistication. You must learn to speak the language that your addiction speaks, which is not the language of logic or willpower, but the language of symbols, of images, of archetypal narratives. You must become fluent in the mythology of your own soul. Every addiction tells a mythic story. The alcoholic may be living out the myth of Dionysus, the god who brings ecstasy and madness in equal measure. The gambler might be channeling the archetype of the fool, the one who takes impossible risks in pursuit of impossible dreams. The sex addict could be possessed by Aphrodite, the goddess who demands that passion be honored even when it threatens social order. When you learn to read these mythic patterns, you can begin to work with them consciously. You can find ways of honoring the archetypal energy without being destroyed by it. You can learn to embody the positive aspects of these mythic forces while avoiding their shadow manifestations. The Dionysian alcoholic can learn to access ecstatic states through meditation, dance, music, or other practices that expand consciousness without destroying the nervous system. The gambling fool can find healthy ways to embrace uncertainty and take calculated risks that feed their need for adventure without bankrupting their future. This mythic approach to addiction recovery is what makes the mind trick so powerful. It works with the deepest structures of the psyche rather than just treating surface symptoms. It honors the sacred dimension of human experience while providing practical tools for transformation. But the mind trick requires one more element that is absolutely crucial. You must learn to love yourself through the process of change. Not the kind of self-love that enables destructive behavior, but the kind of self-love that holds you accountable to your highest potential while remaining compassionate about your human limitations. Most people approach their addictions with a mixture of hatred and fear. They hate themselves for being weak or out of control. They fear that they will never be free, that they are fundamentally broken, that they are doomed to repeat the same patterns forever. This hatred and fear actually feed the addiction by creating the very emotional states that drive compulsive behavior. The mind trick teaches you to approach your addiction with curiosity instead of condemnation, with compassion instead of criticism. When you feel the familiar urge to engage in your compulsive behavior, instead of panicking or beating yourself up, you learn to get curious. Interesting. What is this feeling trying to tell me? What need is trying to emerge? What part of me is asking for attention? This shift from self-attack to self-inquiry is revolutionary. It transforms your addiction from an enemy to be defeated into a teacher to be consulted. It allows you to extract the wisdom from your compulsive patterns without being enslaved by them. But this compassionate inquiry must be paired with what I call fierce boundaries, the ability to say no to destructive behavior while saying yes to the deeper need beneath it. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of the mind trick, because it requires you to hold two seemingly contradictory positions simultaneously: complete acceptance of your addiction as a teacher and absolute refusal to let it destroy your life. Most people think these positions are mutually exclusive. They believe you must either fight your addiction or surrender to it, resist it or accept it, hate it or love it. But the mind trick operates in the space between these false polarities. It teaches you to love the messenger while rejecting the message delivery system, to honor the archetypal energy while refusing its destructive expression. This requires developing what I call conscious containment, the ability to feel the full intensity of your compulsive urges without being overwhelmed by them. It means learning to sit with the fire of craving without being burned by it. It demands that you become strong enough to hold paradox, spacious enough to contain contradiction, wise enough to discern between what serves your evolution and what serves your destruction. Let me tell you about Maria, a woman whose relationship with food had become a daily battle that consumed every waking moment. She would swing between periods of rigid restriction and episodes of compulsive consumption, each cycle leaving her more defeated than the last. When she came to me, she was convinced that her body had betrayed her, that food was her enemy, that she was fundamentally flawed in some irreparable way. But when we began to explore the psychological landscape beneath her compulsive eating, what emerged was a story of profound disconnection from her own sensual nature. Maria had been raised in an environment where pleasure was suspect, where the body was seen as something to be controlled rather than celebrated, where hunger of any kind was viewed as weakness. Her compulsive eating was not really about food. It was her soul's desperate attempt to reconnect with the sensual, embodied aspects of herself that had been systematically rejected since childhood. The binges were crude attempts at self-nourishment, not just physical, but emotional and spiritual. She was trying to feed hungers that had nothing to do with calories or nutrition. The breakthrough came when Maria stopped trying to control her relationship with food and started trying to understand what her eating was trying to accomplish. She began to see that her compulsive consumption was a distorted attempt at self-care, a misguided effort to provide herself with the comfort and nurturing that she had never learned to give herself consciously. Instead of restricting her food intake, Maria began to explore other ways of nurturing herself. She started taking warm baths, getting massages, surrounding herself with beautiful objects and textures. She began to cultivate a more loving relationship with her own body, treating it as a sacred vessel rather than an enemy to be conquered. As she developed these conscious forms of self-nourishment, the compulsive eating began to lose its grip. Not because she had willpowered her way through the cravings, but because she had given her psyche better options for meeting its legitimate needs for comfort, pleasure, and sensual satisfaction. This is the essence of conscious containment. You learn to provide your soul with what it is actually hungry for, instead of forcing it to accept crude substitutes that never truly satisfy. You become a conscious caretaker of your own psychological and spiritual needs, anticipating them before they become desperate enough to express themselves through compulsive behavior. But conscious containment also requires something else, the development of what I call sacred timing. You must learn to recognize when you are in a state of psychological vulnerability that makes you susceptible to compulsive behavior, and you must have strategies in place for navigating these vulnerable moments without falling into old patterns. These vulnerable moments are not random. They follow predictable patterns based on your unique psychological makeup, your life circumstances, your stress levels, your emotional state. The mind trick teaches you to become an expert in your own vulnerability patterns so that you can prepare for them instead of being blindsided by them. Some people are most vulnerable when they are tired, when their psychological defenses are worn down and their capacity for conscious choice is diminished. Others become susceptible during periods of high stress, when the pressure of daily life overwhelms their coping mechanisms. Still others find themselves at risk during transitions when the familiar structures of their lives are shifting and they feel unmoored. The key is learning to read your own internal weather patterns, to recognize the psychological conditions that precede compulsive episodes. This requires developing an intimate relationship with your own inner landscape, becoming fluent in the subtle signals that your psyche sends when it is moving toward a state of vulnerability. Once you can recognize these patterns, you can begin to intervene before the compulsive behavior takes hold. This is not about suppressing your vulnerability. That would only create more pressure in the system. It is about meeting your vulnerable moments with conscious care instead of unconscious reactivity. When you feel the familiar psychological conditions that precede your compulsive behavior, instead of waiting for the craving to become overwhelming, you can ask, what does this vulnerable part of me need right now? What would it feel like to give myself what I actually need instead of what I think I want? This proactive approach to vulnerability is what makes the mind trick so effective. Instead of being reactive victims of your compulsive patterns, you become conscious guardians of your own psychological well-being. You learn to recognize and address your needs before they become desperate enough to express themselves through destructive behavior. But there is another dimension to the mind trick that operates on an even deeper level. You must learn to see your addiction not just as a personal problem, but as a participation in collective patterns that are much larger than your individual story. Every addiction connects you to archetypal currents that flow through the entire human species. The alcoholic is not just struggling with their personal relationship to alcohol, they are participating in humanity's ancient relationship with substances that promise transcendence but deliver bondage. The sex addict is not just dealing with personal compulsions, they are engaged with archetypal patterns around sexuality, intimacy, and the sacred feminine that have been distorted by centuries of cultural conditioning. When you begin to see your addiction in this larger context, it stops feeling so personal, so shameful, so isolating. You realize that you are not uniquely broken or fundamentally flawed. You are participating in patterns that are as old as consciousness itself. This perspective does not excuse destructive behavior, but it does provide a framework for understanding it that is both compassionate and empowering. Your addiction becomes a doorway into understanding not just your own psychology, but the psychology of the species. It connects you to the collective shadow, to the parts of human nature that every culture tries to suppress or control. And paradoxically, this connection to the collective dimension of your struggle can become a source of healing rather than shame. When you understand that your addiction is not just your personal failure, but your participation in archetypal patterns that affect all of humanity, you can begin to work with it as a form of service rather than just self-improvement. Your healing becomes a contribution to the collective healing of these ancient wounds. This shift in perspective, from personal pathology to archetypal participation, is one of the most powerful aspects of the mind trick. It transforms your addiction from a source of isolation into a bridge of connection, It helps you see that your struggle is not evidence of your uniqueness in brokenness, but evidence of your deep participation in the human condition. But this archetypal understanding must be grounded in practical action. It is not enough to understand your addiction intellectually or even spiritually. You must learn to embody a different relationship with the forces that drive compulsive behavior. This requires what I call somatic intelligence, the ability to work with addiction at the level of the body, the nervous system, the felt sense of experience. Most approaches to addiction focus primarily on the mind, on changing thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors through mental strategies. But addiction lives in the body as much as it lives in the mind. It is encoded in your nervous system, woven into your cellular memory, embedded in the very fabric of your physical being. The mind trick recognizes that lasting transformation requires working with addiction somatically, learning to change your relationship with compulsive urges at the level of bodily sensation rather than just mental conception. This means developing the capacity to feel your cravings without being compelled to act on them, to experience the physical sensations of withdrawal or craving without being overwhelmed by them. This somatic approach to addiction recovery is based on the understanding that compulsive urges are not just psychological phenomena. They are energetic events that move through your body in predictable patterns. When you learn to track these patterns, to feel them without resisting them, to breathe with them rather than fighting against them, they begin to lose their compulsive power. The craving becomes just another sensation moving through your body, no different from hunger or tiredness or any other temporary physical state. It loses its ability to hijack your consciousness and compel you to act against your better judgment. You develop what I call urge surfing, the ability to ride the waves of compulsive desire without being swept away by them. This requires developing an entirely different relationship with discomfort. Most people are so afraid of the physical sensations associated with craving that they will do anything to avoid them, including engaging in the very behaviors they are trying to eliminate. They mistake temporary discomfort for actual danger, confusing the sensation of withdrawal with genuine threat to their survival. The mind trick teaches you to befriend discomfort, to see it as information rather than emergency. When you feel the familiar sensations of craving, instead of panicking or immediately seeking relief, you learn to get curious about what is happening in your body. Where do you feel the sensation? How does it move? What happens if you breathe into it rather than resisting it? This somatic curiosity transforms your relationship with craving from one of fear and avoidance to one of interested observation. The sensation stops being an enemy to be defeated and becomes a teacher to be consulted. You begin to understand that cravings are temporary phenomena that arise and pass away like weather patterns, intense while they are present, but ultimately impermanent. But the somatic dimension of the mind trick goes deeper than just managing cravings. It requires you to develop what I call embodied presence, the ability to inhabit your body fully rather than living primarily in your head. Many people with addictions are essentially dissociated from their physical experience, using substances or behaviors to avoid feeling what is actually happening in their bodies. The path to freedom requires the opposite, learning to come home to your body, to feel what is actually present rather than what you wish were present or what you fear might be present. This is not comfortable work. The body holds memories, traumas, and sensations that the mind has been working overtime to avoid. But when you learn to be present with your embodied experience, including the difficult parts, you develop a kind of internal stability that cannot be shaken by external circumstances or internal cravings. You become anchored in your own physical reality rather than floating in fantasies or fears about what might happen. This embodied presence becomes the foundation for all other aspects of recovery. When you are grounded in your body, you can feel your emotions without being overwhelmed by them. You can experience thoughts without believing they are absolute truth. You can notice cravings without assuming you must act on them. The mind trick teaches you that your body is not the enemy of your recovery, it is your most reliable ally. Your body knows the difference between genuine need and compulsive craving. It can distinguish between nourishing experiences and depleting ones. It carries the wisdom you need to navigate your way back to wholeness. But you must learn to listen to this bodily wisdom, to trust the intelligence of your physical experience rather than overriding it with mental strategies or willpower. This requires developing a completely different relationship with your own instincts and impulses. Instead of seeing all desires as dangerous, you learn to discern between desires that serve your evolution and desires that serve your destruction. Instead of suppressing all impulses, you develop the capacity to feel them fully while choosing consciously which ones to follow. This discernment is not mental, it is felt. Your body knows the difference between the hollow pull of compulsive craving and the full-bodied yes of authentic desire. When you are connected to your embodied intelligence, you can feel whether a particular choice will nourish you or deplete you, whether it will move you toward wholeness or fragmentation. The mind trick shows you how to use your addiction as a training ground for developing this somatic discernment. Every time you feel a compulsive urge, you have an opportunity to practice feeling without reacting, sensing without suppressing, choosing consciously rather than being driven unconsciously. This practice transforms your nervous system over time. You develop what neuroscientists call distress tolerance, the ability to experience intense sensations without being compelled to change them immediately. Your window of tolerance expands, allowing you to remain present with increasingly difficult experiences without fragmenting or dissociating. As your capacity to be present with difficulty increases, your addiction begins to lose its function as an escape mechanism. You no longer need to flee from your experience because you have developed the internal resources to meet whatever arises with consciousness rather than reactivity. But the mind trick has one final dimension that brings all these elements together into a unified approach to transformation. You must learn to see your recovery not as the elimination of your addiction, but as the integration of the archetypal forces that created it in the first place. This integration process is what transforms addiction from a problem to be solved into a teacher to be honored. Instead of trying to eliminate the parts of yourself that created the compulsive behavior, you learn to give them conscious expression in healthy, sustainable ways. The wild part of you that drove your addiction does not need to be destroyed. It needs to be channeled. The hungry part that created the compulsion does not need to be starved. It needs to be fed with genuine nourishment. The rebellious part that expressed itself through destructive behavior does not need to be suppressed. It needs to be given meaningful ways to challenge the status quo. This integration process is the culmination of everything the mind trick has been preparing you for. It is where you discover that your addiction was never really about the substance or behavior itself. It was about your soul's determination to reclaim exiled aspects of yourself, even if it had to use the crudest possible methods to accomplish this reclamation. When you understand this, your entire relationship with your addiction transforms. It stops being your enemy and becomes your teacher. It stops being evidence of your brokenness and becomes proof of your psyche's intelligence. It stops being something to be ashamed of and becomes something to be grateful for, because it forced you to embark on a journey of self-discovery that you might never have undertaken otherwise. This gratitude is not naive or premature. It does not ignore the real damage that addiction can cause or minimize the genuine suffering it creates, but it recognizes that even our most destructive patterns often carry within them the seeds of our greatest transformation. The mind trick teaches you to harvest those seeds, to extract the wisdom from your addiction without being enslaved by its methods. It shows you how to become conscious collaborators in your own healing rather than passive victims of compulsive forces beyond your control. This collaboration requires everything we have explored: archetypal literacy, somatic intelligence, conscious containment, embodied presence, and fierce compassion for the parts of yourself that created the addiction as a survival mechanism. It demands that you become both student and teacher, patient and healer, seeker and guide. But most importantly, it requires you to trust the process of your own becoming. Your addiction did not arise randomly or meaninglessly. It emerged from the intelligent depths of your psyche as a crude but determined attempt to restore balance to a system that had been thrown off its natural axis. The mind trick works because it honors this intelligence instead of trying to override it. It teaches you to become conscious participants in the healing process that your addiction was unconsciously trying to initiate. It shows you how to complete the work that your compulsive behavior began, but to complete it consciously, skillfully, in ways that create wholeness rather than fragmentation. This is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of a completely different kind of relationship with yourself and with the archetypal forces that shape human experience. It is the doorway into what I call conscious living, where every choice is made from awareness rather than compulsion, where every action serves your evolution rather than your destruction. The mind trick that ends addiction forever is not really a trick at all. It is a return to the natural intelligence that has been present within you all along, waiting for you to remember how to access it, waiting for you to trust it enough to let it guide you home to yourself.